Baldur's Gate 3 isn't Dungeons & Dragons, and that's okay. Okay? Good. Glad we got that out of the way. Oh, you want me to elaborate? Well, since you asked. Baldur's Gate 3 has absolutely taken over our tiny minds here at GGRecon Towers. So much so that I've now lost almost as many hours to it as I've lost to another great love of my life, my D&D campaign. Oh yeah, we're opening that can of worms today. If you've been on the Baldur's Gate or D&D side of the internet over the last couple of days, you'll likely have seen some of the discourse around how rigid Baldur's Gate 3 is when it comes to staying within the rules of the system it's based on, D&D 5th edition, or 5e for short. And between all the arguing, it got me thinking about how Baldur's Gate 3 actually implements D&D mechanics, from the combat to the dice rolls into its story and gameplay, and whether or not it's actually a fair comparison, and ultimately, I'm not sure it is. I mean, obviously, Baldur's Gate 3 is based on Dungeons & Dragons, but I think by smashing the two together and suggesting that Baldur's Gate 3 is bad because it copies D&D's systems, or that D&D is bad because Baldur's Gate 3's mechanics can be broken, kinda misses the point. 5e as a tabletop RPG has a lot of quirks, and for the most part, Baldur's Gate 3 copies it pretty well, often to its detriment, as it takes the rules as written of 5e and applies them stringently throughout the game. Well, kind of. Actually, sometimes it straight up ignores cornerstones of the game design, but we'll get to that. Oh yeah, we're talking about the rules of game design, everyone. That's the party companion everyone wants to romance, right? Take a look at Mage Hand. It's a prime example. In D&D, Mage Hand is an incredibly useful spell. It creates a spectral floating hand that you can control to perform actions for you, like pulling levers or causing distractions, and its relative usefulness basically comes down to player ingenuity and whether your DM allows shenanigans or not. Remember that word. We'll be coming to it later. Whereas in Baldur's Gate 3, it can't, say, float up to a higher elevation than you, even though there's nothing in the actual rules that dictates whether it should be able to or not. It's a floating hand for Shah's sake. So maybe Baldur's Gate 3 is a little too rigid in its approach to rules and spells. Well, no, but let's look elsewhere for this rigid application of rules, shall we? Combat is definitely locked in, and one of the criticisms thrown out at D&D, and by extension Baldur's Gate 3, is that once a fight starts, you can't really de-escalate it without DM allowances. There are no mechanics that allow for surrender and parlaying, short of running away. There's also been a lot of chat about how Baldur's Gate 3 being a video game with only a set number of approaches ultimately possible, no matter how much the devs tried to account for player creativity, that the shenanigans that define every D&D campaign aren't strictly possible outside of a few niche scenarios. This is, after all, usually the role of the Dungeon Master. Yes, D&D asks that when a player wants to do something, there is usually a dice roll required and a difficulty class that must be beaten in order to succeed, but if you want to do something more outside the box in Baldur's Gate 3, you can't rely on a friendly DM to say, you know, that's cool as hell, I'll allow it. But here's the thing. Those of you who think D&D players have gone soft and that Baldur's Gate 3 is somehow exactly how D&D is supposed to be played because it follows the rules, all the way to those of you who realise it's a flawed system with plenty of issues and would prefer more player-related shenanigans to be allowed, you're both kind of right. Because yes, Baldur's Gate 3 does apply the rules of D&D a bit too stringently at times, but it also either completely misunderstands them, leading to some fantastically broken things you can do in later levels, or manages to create a new layer for player shenanigans to develop. It's just your shenanigans have to be pre-planned rather than as in the moment as they might be in your standard D&D campaign. A few months ago, in a campaign IDM, at the end of a grueling fight, our party's paladin wanted to try and swipe at a flying enemy in a last gasp attempt to stop them from getting away. They used a spell called Dimension Door to teleport 200 feet up just above where the enemy was, and then divine smited them down to the ground from 200 feet up. It was heroic, it was glorious, it was hype, and yet as per the rules as written of D&D 5e, it shouldn't actually have been allowed. Now, I didn't rob them of that moment by retconning it because I'm not a monster, but in Baldur's Gate 3, you wouldn't have even been able to try. But with enough planning and preparation, you are more than capable of being able to pull off something similar, or frankly, even more ludicrous circumnavigations of the rules to do absurd levels of damage or kill bosses outright. And that's without even considering the idea that you'd be able to convince an owlbear to climb boxes you've somehow managed to stack hundreds of meters high, and then jump off them and people's elbow some poor sap underneath them. Or the fact that no one in the game questions when you're carrying several barrels full of gunpowder around town and placing them at strategic locations about the place. Excuse me, adventurer, where are you going with all those barrels? Oh, nothing to see here, officer, just planting the equivalent of several sticks of dynamite outside every seat of power in the city. Move on along. I guess what I'm saying is Baldur's Gate 3 has both benefited and suffered from its comparison to D&D. And often it doesn't force you to play by 5e's rules more than it just lets you break them. 5e is a flawed system in many ways. You only have to look at the several ways DMs and players alike gently, or sometimes not so gently, tweak the rules so they make sense to them. But honestly, the even more granular gamification of some of its mechanics and systems actually make them work better. Turning shove into a bonus action, for example, is an absolute dream of a change for melee classes and gives them a power buff beyond what they get in 5e, where spellcasters generally get all the love. And allowing you to drink a potion as a bonus action, something that, let me tell you, has caused more arguments at tables than a poorly worded political opinion at a family Christmas, makes perfect sense in a video game just as much as it would in a tabletop one. Hell, you can cast 2 leveled spells in a turn if you're clever by using Quicken Spell or Haste, which you can't usually do in 5e, because there's a blanket rule that permits you to only cast 1 leveled spell per turn. Now that's required for balance in 5e, but in a video game, breaking it is kind of part of the fun, innit? So you can allow these more gamified interactions to occur without worrying about the balance considerations. Too much, anyway. At least they managed to balance the ability to long rest after every encounter by having the game world just carry on without you. Sleeping for 8 hours outside a burning tavern and everyone's suddenly ashes when you wake up. That's on you, my friend. At the end of the day, comparisons between 5e and Baldur's Gate 3 are always going to happen. Baldur's Gate 3 is based on the entire D&D system, but you shouldn't go into it expecting it to play out like your weekly game at your mate's table. And nor should anyone expect everyone to suddenly adhere to the stringent rules just because they prefer the game to play out like a tactical battle simulator. If you want to turn your karmic dice off or keep them on, go ahead. It might not be the most satisfying conclusion, but the fact is, everyone's right, and you can play how you like. But Baldur's Gate 3 isn't D&D, and that's okay with me. And if you're still looking for more Baldur's Gate 3 content, because, well, why wouldn't you? Check out this video, where we prove that you need to play as the Dark Urge in your next playthrough.